Good evening and welcome to Tysky Sow. We have three massive stories for you this evening. First off, the Indian variant of coronavirus. Is it going to throw us off course in terms of the great unlocking? And why did Boris Johnson not do anything to control it for the past 2 months? We're also going to be talking about the latest from Palestine. Joe Biden has finally called for a ceasefire, and the people of Palestine have gone on a 24-hour general strike. We've got a great guest lined up for you on that topic. And we are going to end with, I feel bad now that I've called it a big story because it's not that big, but it is entertaining. It is the most astonishing answer yet we have heard from a Labour frontbencher when they're asked what their vision is. Get ready to cringe. Dalia, Gebrial, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm feeling consistently gaslit by this weather. Like, it's bright and sunny, and then in a tiny moment just turns into pissing it down with rain. So I'm very, sort of unnerved by it, but I'm doing well.
Just never leave the house and it doesn't matter. It works for me. I'm just here on my computer, streaming, doesn't raining outside, whatever. Sometimes I wander to the shops. That's all I can do. If it's raining, that's fine. As ever, you know what to do. Do tweet your comments, your questions, your thoughts on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Keep your super chats coming. And most importantly, if you have not already, do hit that subscribe button. Make sure you subscribe to the Novara Media YouTube channel. We go live 3 nights a week and we put videos out every day. Let's go straight on to our first story. The B.1.617.2 variant of coronavirus was first identified in India, and it is the single biggest threat to Britain leaving lockdown on schedule. That's because it's more transmissible. We know that for almost certain. It's potentially also more resistant to vaccines. That one we're less sure about. Both of those are in comparison to the Kent variant, which we know was already more transmissible than the original COVID variant. Much of this, as I've said, remains uncertain, but Boris Johnson has been clear that this could risk the current schedule of removing all COVID restrictions on the 21st of June.
We're keeping everything under very close observation. We'll know a lot more in a few days' time.
So it's not changing your approach yet?
We're keeping everything under very, very careful, close review. We're looking at all the data as it comes in from places like Bolton, Blackburn, Bedford, Sefton, other places, just looking at those curves where they're moving, trying to understand whether the Indian variant is more transmissible, and if so, by how much more it's transmissible, and also trying to understand to what extent our vaccine program has already sufficiently fortified us all against it. And I'm afraid we've just got a few more days of looking at that data. But as things stand at the moment, I can see nothing conclusive in the data to say that we have to deviate from the present roadmap. But we've got to be cautious, and we'll be letting people know in a few days' time.
So up for debate there is whether or not all restrictions will be removed on the 21st of June. Remember, we were supposed to be able to go to clubs and to basically, fundamentally go back to normal. Depending on how transmissible this new variant is, that could be at risk. That's the future. There are some suggestions that there were people in government who were concerned about the loosening of restrictions that already happened this Monday. That's because of the spread of this new, more transmissible variant. Sky has reported that urgent discussions were being held in Whitehall nearly 2 weeks ago over what to do about the Indian variant, with some advisors urging ministers not to proceed with this week's stage-3 lockdown lifting on Monday. Some scientists believe that decision to unlock was a mistake, while a Tory source said that some ministers were sympathetic to the idea the PM was pressing ahead too fast. Now, this all makes sense. Again, lots of uncertainty. It could easily turn out to be the correct decision to open on Monday, but there are some significant risks here. And that's because while the vaccination program is going well, I think 7 out of 10 adults have now had their first dose of the vaccine. That still leaves 30% of adults without it. And if you include children who at the moment can't be vaccinated, 45% of the population remain unvaccinated. Now, we don't know quite how much more transmissible the Indian variant is, but it could be up to 50% more transmissible. And so it's easy to imagine how opening bars and restaurants, which are in many cases frequented by people who are under 40 who might not have been offered that vaccine yet, that could create new surges and new cases. As I say, in terms of what implications this will have, what exact implications this will have for policy in Britain, there are still more uncertainties to work out. Something we do know, though, is that because of this variant, our schedule for unlocking is at a risk it wasn't at beforehand. You know, we were doing pretty well. If you remember what the politicians were saying, what the chief scientists were saying, it was almost getting close to, you know, everything is going as well as it possibly could have gone. That has all changed in the last 2 weeks, which raises the question, how did we get here? Why did Boris Johnson let us get here? I'm going to give you a timeline of how we got to this mess. And the key thing here is why it took so long for Boris Johnson to put India on the red list so that people would have to quarantine, go into mandatory hotel quarantine on arrival in Britain because of the prevalence of a variant of concern in India. Let's take you through the last couple of months. So the 22nd of March is the first key date I'm going to show you. This is, you know, the surge of COVID cases in India was really rocketing by this point, 372,000 weekly cases, which was triple the rate from 3 weeks before that. So you can see there's a huge outbreak. We talked about it at the time, and still flights were coming into Britain. It wasn't on the red list. On the 24th of March, India's health ministry warned of a double mutant variant. Then on the 2nd of April, the UK announces that 4 countries would be added to the red list, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, but not including India. Then on the 6th of April, new daily cases in India pass 100,000 per day. Johnson refuses to cancel his trade trip to India, planned for later that month. We're going to go on to a few more dates in a moment. First of all, the thing to notice here, you've got a huge outbreak in India. We were talking about it at the time. Everyone was talking about it at the time because it was so shocking and awful. Still is, by the way. We also knew by that point in time that there was a significant variant of concern in India. Boris Johnson had a trade trip planned to India, which, even though there were 100,000 cases per day in India, he did not cancel. He said, we're going to go forward with that trade trip. Pakistan and Bangladesh on the red list, India not, for some reason. No good reasons, which is what I'm going to go on to in a moment. First of all, some more dates for you. 15th of April, for the first time, the B1617 variant appears on official statistics of cases in the UK. That was with 77 cases detected. Then on the 19th of April, the number of cases with Indian variant rises to 103. Boris Johnson then finally cancels his trip to India, and Matt Hancock announces India will be placed on the red list. However, it's not for another 4 days until red list restrictions come into force for travellers from India. So you can see there lots and lots and lots of stalling. It was a month between the period when the Indian Health Ministry warned of this new mutant and Britain introduced restrictions for travellers from India. So this could have been foreseen well in advance, and nothing happened. Now, as I said, the key question here is, why did India get placed on the red list 3 weeks after Bangladesh and Pakistan? Why would that happen? Now, the accusation against Boris Johnson is that's because he was trying to work out a trade deal with India, but not the other 2 countries. What the government are trying to push back and say is, no, there were epidemiological reasons why we made that distinction between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. Matt Hancock, let's go to his defense of why this was a legitimate and sort of scientifically justified move. He said, the truth is that when we put Pakistan and Bangladesh on the red list, positivity among those arriving from those countries was 3 times higher than it was among those arriving from India. Now, that would be a good argument. Unfortunately, it doesn't tally with the data from Test and Trace. So some of these statistics we've got from a great report in the Mirror, I should say. I should credit them for this, really. And these are the proportions of people who tested positive for COVID-19 on arrival to Britain from Pakistan, which was 6%, from India, which was 5%, and from Bangladesh, which was 4%. That was from the period the 25th of March to the 7th of April. As you can see, they're very difficult to explain why Pakistan and Bangladesh were put on the red list, but India wasn't. It's also the case that India had more people coming in actually with variants of concerns than in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So absolutely no reason why they should have been treated differently when it comes to the science of all of this. That's why we think it was potentially because of the politics of all of this. Let's go to the politics. It's because Britain, or it seems to be because Britain was desperate to sign a trade deal with the world's 6th largest economy. That was certainly the suggestion in this morning's Politico Playbook email. So in that email this morning, sort of gives you a big review of the news to come that day. Alex Wickham writes, why did they delay? Despite Downing Street's strenuous denials, there is barely anyone in Westminster who doesn't think the government held off putting India on the red list because Johnson had a trade trip to the country planned. Now, Wickham also referenced a source who suggested that senior scientific advisors were warning that India should be placed on the red list at least 10 days ahead of the cancellation of Johnson's trip on April the 19th. And Wickham had more info from the same source. So he writes, the same person said memos from British officials to staff based in India had queried if the trip ought to go ahead from late March onwards, as scientists scrambled to work out why infections were rocketing in the nation. This, they said, is underlined by notes on technical briefings on tracking variants, which note an Indian strain as far back as April the 1st, some 7 weeks ago. Now, as I said, there are still a lot of unknowns about the precise details, the precise danger of this variant. But what we do know is that there are currently 2,967 known cases of the Indian variant, or cases which have been identified in Britain, which is up 28% since Monday. So clearly something quite worrying going on. Dalia, I want your thoughts on this. Yet again, it seems that we have had Boris Johnson put politics and short-term economic interest ahead of public health. In terms of the economy, it's clearly going to backfire if he now has to delay the ultimate unlocking of the economy. But it does seem like no lessons have been learnt at all over the past 12 months.
I mean, that is the story of Johnson's handling of the pandemic, isn't it? And I just want to say, you think everything is under control and, going as scheduled, and then someone whips out the phrase double mutant variant, and you're like, oh, we're just puny humans. Like, we don't stand a chance. But, first of all, it goes without saying that we've seen time and time again in this pandemic, and it's been exposed by this pandemic, something that we always knew, which is that bordering choices are political. There's always this kind of idea that borders are like necessary for scientific or objective reasons. But they are primarily governed actually by both geopolitical but also domestic political desires and power plays. And we know that from the fact that, despite the US having one of the highest per capita infection rates, that I don't think we've had far less restriction on movement between the US and the UK than we have for other countries. And where, they've had a much lower per capita rate of infection. But this is also, I think there's two issues here, right? So there's the fact that, again, this is this problem with Johnson's way of handling this pandemic that has come back to bite us over and over again, of sort of over-promising and over-committing, and then making it very difficult to then leave space to make the decisions that are responsive to the actual conditions on the ground and to what is actually in the best interest of everyone. And that flexibility and expectation is so important with this virus because, as we've known, its patterns are not entirely predictable. And we can see this by the massive spike in India. Even though this virus has been with us for a year now, we haven't seen conditions like that until this particular moment. And we saw this in the UK at Christmas, where, Boris makes this big PR stunt about saving Christmas, which was all about politics and optics, only that to then turn around and give people 24 hours notice that they had to stay put, during which a lot of people just went ahead with their plans anyway. And we're seeing it again with this, bombastic commitment that, everything's going to go back to normal on the 21st of June. And, as if we are in complete control of that, but also that we are unlikely to actually have a complete return to, and I don't want to say normal, but a return to a time where what we can do is not so heavily defined and governed by this virus. And that's unlikely for a very long time. not least because vaccination programs in the global south countries are, thanks to, you know, vaccine protectionism in the UK and in Europe and North America, that, you know, vaccination programs are nowhere near where we need them to be. But also because this virus mutates, right? And we know that possibility of a mutation that is, you know, as contagious or even more contagious, and which can circumvent the vaccine and put us back into a very difficult position, that possibility is not small, it's not negligible, it's very real. And yet this claim that we can put a date on when we're no longer going to manage living with this virus is an attempt at political point scoring that is detached from reality and actually damages our long-term ability to adjust to living with this virus in different ways. And we know this from the past, that overpromising leads to undercompliance and it leads to lack of trust. So we're in a situation now where, even though many scientists have long been suggesting that, you know, opening up at the speed because of, you know, the variant that was discovered in India, but also because of the delays to AstraZeneca being given to younger people, that opening up at the speed that we were promised is not a good idea. But Johnson is finding himself in a position where where it feels impossible to take decisions that are scientifically and medically sound. But I also think, and this is perhaps this is related to that point and is perhaps not necessarily, I think it just kind of goes to, again, like the fragility of the progress in comparison to the way that Boris Johnson wants to portray it, which is, you know, through this idea that, you know, we can place dates on when we're going to go entirely back to 2019, to how things were in 2019. And I think it comes down as well to this idea that the government strategy has been to sort of treat and talk about the vaccine as this kind of fix-all magic bullet that's going to take us back to before this was ever, you know, in our lives. But we know, not only because of the possibility of mutations, but also the increased likelihood of other pandemics, thanks to, you know, as a result of climate change and other reasons, that the vaccine is a huge development. It's a great development. It's a brilliant development, but it's not a fix-all. Building the infrastructure to cope with pandemics, to cope with possible mutations and variants that can circumvent the vaccine. And that includes things like a robust and reliable test, track and trace system, a robust social safety net so that people can make decisions based on, you know, whether they can keep what is in the best interests of their health and the health of their community, rather than, you know, having to go to work, even if it's not safe. But also infrastructures of care so that people are not sort of left to fend for themselves for months on end when these kinds of public health crises happen. And that developing that infrastructure alongside a vaccine is actually the only way that we can have a resilient or long-term sense of normalcy. And I think that, to an extent, the vaccine is offering a dangerously reductive sense of hope, that, you know, is allowing the government to kind of paper over the fact that they haven't learned the lessons from this pandemic to actually prepare us for the very real possibility of, you know, vaccine-resistant mutations and other public health crises that are likely to become more regular as a result of climate change. And one of the reasons that countries like South Korea were so effective in managing this pandemic, even before there was a vaccine and even before we understood even how to treat the virus well, was because they learned the lessons from SARS and they built the infrastructure and were able to rely on that infrastructure that had been built as a result of the SARS pandemic. But I'm not convinced that the government has done the same here, and that worries me.
Yeah, I mean, worry is a good conclusion, I think, to this whole furore. We're going to go through one other controversy today. This has been, again, about travel, but not so much about the holes in the restrictions in the past, but what the new rules are and the confusion about what the new rules are. So if you weren't aware, travel is no longer, or holidays are no longer banned. That's since Monday. We now have a traffic light system where countries are either on the green, the amber, or the red list. On the green list, you can go there with fairly few restrictions. The red list is as it always was. You're not supposed to go there at all. The amber list, government ministers have been fairly ambiguous about when you should and shouldn't go, on visits to those places. Now, that was a line of attack from Keir Starmer to Boris Johnson today at PMQs. Let's take a look at that exchange.
Mr. Speaker, I think everybody would agree that having moved 170 countries to the amber list, absolute clarity is needed about the circumstance in which people can travel to an amber country. Yesterday morning, the Environment Secretary said people could fly to amber list countries if they wanted to visit family or friends. By the afternoon, a government health minister said nobody should travel outside Britain this year, and travelling is dangerous. The Prime Minister said that travel to amber countries should only be where it's essential. By the evening, the Welsh Secretary suggested some people might think a holiday is essential. The government's lost control of the messaging. So can the Prime Minister answer a really simple question that goes to the heart of this? If he doesn't want people to travel to amber list countries, if that's his position, he doesn't want them to travel to amber list countries, why has he made it easier for them to do so?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that after more than a year of this, I think that the honourable gentleman would understand that what the public would like to see is some effort to back up what the government is saying, to deliver clarity of messages. And on his point about legal bans, as he knows, we're trying to move away from endlessly legislating for everything and to rely on guidance and asking people to do the right thing. And it is very, very clear, Mr. Speaker, you should not be going to an amber list country except for some extreme circumstance, such as the serious illness of a family member. You should not be going to an amber list country on holiday, Mr. Speaker. I can imagine he wants to take a holiday, but you should not be going to an amber list country on holiday, Mr. Speaker. And if you do go to an amber list country, then, as I say, we will enforce the 10-day quarantine period.
And I think that exchange actually summarises what's been so kind of stupid about this whole COVID debate. Because for me, of things to attack the government for, some ambiguity about what the amber category means when it comes to travel is kind of unreasonable, because there are always going to be some areas of ambiguity. I think it kind of makes sense to say the green countries you can be fairly relaxed about, the red countries are going to be almost impossible to go to, and the amber ones, it's going to be a real rigmarole to go there. But if you really need to, for a funeral or for an operation, you can do. That's not just to say that Keir Starmer was wrong to use that as the attack line, though. It's also Boris Johnson's response to that was so similarly stupid, right? He didn't say, look, we're going to need to have some ambiguity when it comes to COVID rules. The world isn't particularly black and white. It's fine to have some areas where the rules might seem quite arbitrary, but that's just us trying to respond to a complicated situation. No, instead he says, you Labour Party, I think what the government wants to hear is you backing everything we say. So it's just this completely stupid politicized argument. Anyone who watches that exchange is absolutely none the wiser. And when it comes to what political debate we should be having about travel, it's not this issue of, the public relations aren't good enough. The Keir Starmer classic line of the messaging isn't clear. What we need is clarity. What we need is clarity. It's like, clarity might be fine. It's better to be clear than not clear if you can be clear. But the real issue here, the real problem with travel over the past 6 months, in fact, over the past 12 months, over the past 18 months, is that we haven't had a proper democratic debate about what we value. And I think the Indian variant is the key example here. I think if we'd had a proper debate back at the start of the year where they said, look, we have two options. We can either basically make travel really, really difficult just for this short temporary period of time, as they did in New Zealand and Australia and Vietnam. And that will mean that we have way less uncertainty in our route out of lockdown. We could do that. We could decide that. Or we could decide that we think travel in between countries is so important that we're going to not enforce something along the lines of mandatory hotel quarantine. Now, we took the second decision. Well, I say we took the second decision. Actually, my point is we did not take that second decision, because I bet you if they'd asked the public that question and had a serious grown-up debate, they would have gone for the first one. But no, what they did is they listened to basically the aviation sector, all of these vested interests who would prefer to take the short-term risk because the biggest risk for them is losing business, right? And then that's how we're in this messed up situation. So you've got the Labour Party who are just saying, we don't really have any political problem with anything you're saying. We just want you to say it more competently and more clearly. Then you've got Boris Johnson saying, I don't even know why you're critiquing me at all. We're in a public health crisis. You shouldn't even be in opposition. And then we're all just watching, none the wiser. The media will lap it up because they love any kind of ambiguity. Oh, what if it's you're allowed to go for a funeral? What if it's a funeral of your second cousin? Then are you allowed to go? Gotcha. And I just think it really demonstrates how ridiculous so much of the public debate has been around this pandemic, and how much that means we've missed, because there are serious debates we could be having which are of real consequence, which are being missed because the media find it just so easy to report on. This is unclear, that's unclear. Anyway, just something that personally frustrates me. I just needed to get that off my chest. We are going to go straight on to our next story. Before we do that, if you're enjoying the show, do like the stream. Joe Biden has called for a significant de-escalation by both Israel and Hamas, and has urged both parties to pursue a ceasefire. Now, this is an incredibly weak stance. It ignores that this is not a mere conflict, but an ongoing occupation, and it ignores how casualties have fallen overwhelmingly on one side. Just to call for a ceasefire, to call for both sides to stop exerting violence, as Ash Sarkar said in a recent show, it flattens the whole history, the whole context of what's going on here. However, whilst this is an incredibly weak statement from Joe Biden, it is still an improvement, because up to this point, he has actually been resisting any call for a ceasefire whatsoever. So even the most tepid stance, he has been resisting, not just resisting, he's been blocking it at the UN. So some improvement. Meanwhile, in Palestine, a 24-hour strike has come to a close. Now, this is really significant. A strike across the whole of historic Palestine, all Palestinians taking part, or the vast majority taking part, shutting down businesses for 24 hours at protest, at apartheid, at occupation, at the airstrikes in Gaza. Now, during that strike, as is usually the case in historic Palestine, peaceful protesters were subject to intense repression by Israeli security forces, and that included this incident at the Damascus gates in East Jerusalem. So what you saw there was a peaceful protest, and then the Israeli police throwing stun grenades at protesters. Now, a stun grenade, if you live in Britain like me, you probably never experienced one. What that means is the police throw something at you that bangs so loudly, that flashes so brightly, that you're completely disorientated. For a few seconds, you struggle to see and struggle to hear. Completely disorientating, which is why everyone runs away, because it's so horrible to be around. That's the purpose of that particular, I suppose, weapon, I suppose, really. As well as those stun grenades, we've also seen over the last 2 days, which is not new, by the way, but it's come to light, been raised, become more prominent over the last 2 days, is Israeli police have been spraying rancid water on Palestinians. Now, this is so appalling, really created a lot of shock on social media, quite rightly. We're going to show you a clip that sort of explains what's going on in this respect. This is reporter Mark Stone, and this is a clip from Sky News.
And here in Sheikh Jarrah, about an hour ago, we saw something which happens a lot too at the moment. That is a water cannon, but it's not of the type that you might see in Europe or America, because it's got skunk water in, which has a rancid smell, takes days to get off your skin. And what it does is they spray it ostensibly for crowd control. But I can tell you, because I was here and I saw it with my eyes, they were not controlling a crowd that needed to be controlled. They were controlling a small group of youngsters who posed no threat to them, and yet they fired the water cannon into a Palestinian community and all over Palestinian houses. The Palestinians and human rights groups say this is effectively a form of collective punishment. And lastly, down at the Damascus Gate a little bit earlier on, as part of this mass movement of Palestinians expressing their views, a group of Palestinians were walking out of the Damascus Gate of the old city and up the steps there, and then without any warning the Israeli police threw stun grenades and everyone fled. Again, unnecessary crowd control. We've put this to the Israeli police. We've asked them why they're doing this sort of thing, and they say where they make mistakes they investigate. But you know, I've worked here for quite some time, and I can tell you that when you ask the Israelis for investigation, they say they're doing one, but you never actually get the results. Those are the facts. That's what's happening here on the ground. We do ask the Israelis for a response. They say they'll give it. Often it doesn't come.
So lots to talk about over the past 48 hours. That general strike, a form of resistance, that appalling, grotesque repression you saw there in those two clips, and also a changing stance from the United States, from Joe Biden. To talk about all three things, I'm delighted to be joined by Nasser Al-Masri, a Palestinian-American PhD candidate in political science at MIT and a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Michael. Excited to be here. I wish it was under better circumstances.
So much. Yeah, of course. I want to start by talking about the strike, and in particular the strategy of the strike. Now, you know, most of our audience will be familiar with, you know, the purpose of a strike usually is to cause losses to your boss so that they have to listen to their workers. In this context, I suppose a decolonial context or a context where you're fighting a state, what does a strike do? What's the strategy? What leverage is being used there?
Yeah, I think there are a number of different parts that we can focus on here. So first, this strike has, beyond just having the economic consequences that it will have, which I'll discuss in a moment, I think it was important because it brought together Palestinian youth across all areas where Palestinians are living, and beyond Palestinian youth as well, of course. There's a bunch of civil society groups that were sort of signed on to the strike as well. But historically, Palestinians have been very fragmented, and it's not just related to sort of internal struggles or ideology or location, etc. But it's just the fact that they live in different places and under different circumstances, in refugee camps, in other parts of the West Bank, as Palestinian citizens of Israel, in historic Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, etc. So I think that's one of the key components here. But to your more directly to the point here, the strike had significant consequences, I think, on the Israeli economy, and sort of showed sort of the power that Palestinians have. You know, I think one of the biggest sectors that sort of uses Palestinian labor inside of Israel is construction. And so there are something like 65,000 construction workers that come from the occupied, West Bank and come into Israel to work. Reportedly, 110 of them showed up out of 65,000 yesterday. And so you can imagine the consequences. I saw some numbers that were in the ballpark of $40 million, were basically lost yesterday, which I think translates to something like 30 million British pounds. So I think if we're talking about numbers, right, this is just in one day, and you can imagine that the delays and the backups would become extremely costly. And even beyond, sort of the construction industry, 50% or so of pharmacists inside of historic Palestine, inside of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, 50% of the pharmacists, they make up 25% of doctors and nurses, more than half the construction workers. So we're talking about almost a fifth, or around a fifth of the labor force didn't show up to work yesterday. And so that, you can imagine the consequences it had. You can imagine the pressure it puts on the Netanyahu government, on Benjamin Netanyahu, and sort of this process they're going through, an attempt to form a government. You can imagine the consequences it has, as you say, for their bosses, right? And so, yeah, the sort of the end goal here was to leverage that power across all the places where Palestinians are living in order to sort of make their voices heard in a more direct material way, if you will.
Let's talk about the other form of pressure being exerted on Israel right now, which is international. I mean, calling it pressure might be being too kind to what Joe Biden is currently doing. But he has moved from, I suppose, a completely morally abject position, which is to say Israel has an absolute right to self-defense, and therefore essentially, condoning the airstrikes in Gaza, to saying what I want to see is a ceasefire. Is that a significant shift? Does that exert pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu? And do you think that means a ceasefire will essentially happen quite soon now?
Yeah, it's hard to say when it will happen. I think there's something to think about here. I think on the U.S. side, right, Biden has, obviously the U.S. has blocked Security Council resolutions multiple times this week, but Biden is feeling the pressure, and he has. And this is the same thing with his immigration policy recently that he backtracked on. We were talking about COVID a little bit earlier and related to the patents, right? He's backtracked on a significant number of issues, and this is now, the pressure is breaking through to him. What does it mean for an actual ceasefire? I couldn't say for certain, but it looks like, the negotiations that have been, ongoing sort of behind the scenes, it appears to be at a point where Israel has a desire to continue pummeling Gaza, using this sort of collective punishment. And so the fact that Biden is finally leveraging pressure on Netanyahu, I would imagine in the next week, you're going to hear, if not a ceasefire, you're going to hear an outcome of rejected ceasefire by Israel, which I think could potentially bring the United States and Israel at sort of loggerheads about where they're going. I don't know for certain if Netanyahu can withstand sort of Biden's pressure. We're going to find out what he thinks he can do. He's already taken sort of actions that he wouldn't have taken under Obama's presidency, and so it's unclear exactly what is going to develop. But I have a sense that in the next week or so, you're going to see some conclusions coming out regarding whether they're going to stop or not.
I mean, obviously, a ceasefire is urgently needed. I mean, not least, mainly for the people who are living in Gaza, who are living through hell right now. At the same time, there is a danger that as soon as a ceasefire is announced, the world's media, say, "Oh, problem solved. Quiet has happened again. Quiet has returned. The pressure goes off Joe Biden," and the scenes. I showed at the start of this section of Israeli police firing skunk water at people, rancid water at Palestinians, the kind of thing, it just seems so degrading, so dehumanizing, and throwing stun grenades at peaceful protesters, obviously the expulsion of citizens of Sheikh Jarrah. The list can go on of the various oppressions which are separate from airstrikes in Gaza. Are you concerned that once a ceasefire happens, Israel will essentially once again be off the hook? Yeah.
So, I mean, this is not the first time that there's been an extensive bombardment of Gaza. There's been, coverage of it. And then it sort of went back to the status quo afterwards. It happened in 2014, 2008 and 2009. I could keep going back in time. And so I'm absolutely with you that is a potential danger. I think there's a couple things that are different this time. So for the first time, at least, in history, I'd say the first time in history, really, the U.S. Congress people have made their voices heard regarding their concerns about not only Israeli actions, right? Concerns is a very light word. Their complete opposition to sort of Israeli violence. But they've also called on the President of the United States and other of their counterparts in Congress to bring about an end of U.S. support to Israel, especially the blank check that they provide to Israel every year. And so I think I don't think we should wash that away as nothing. I think this is a meaningful move in the right direction. The sort of Congress has moved to the left, I think, to the surprise of some folks in the United States. And I think a lot of younger folks increasingly are aware of what is going on in Palestine and elsewhere, and are strongly supporting sort of changes in U.S. policy. And that relates to the second point, which is a lot of this was broadcast on social media. The traditional news media you're not included, right? The work being done here is fantastic. But the traditional news media, we're talking CNN, Reuters, right, etc. A lot of these news media they're not giving fair coverage to Palestinians. And, I could share tons of statistics on how much they cover Palestinian deaths versus Israeli deaths, for example. So I think there's a significant shift in sort of the way people are understanding what's going on in Palestine, the views that people have. And I think it's going to come to a tipping point at some point in the near future. If it's not immediately after this sort of episode of Israeli violence, then it will be in the near future, because I think folks really are now understanding what is going on in Palestine. They're now no longer under the delusions that the media has for so long sort of presented, particularly the largest corporations in the media, I should say. And so I think that's a significant shift. But that being said, I think you're absolutely right. When things quiet down, people will, the status quo, returning to the status quo is not ideal. Gaza is still under siege. People still can't access healthcare. People are, the families in Sheikh Jarrah are still awaiting a court ruling on whether they're allowed to live in their homes that they came to after they were forced out, in the 1940s and 1950s. And so, this is, I think, definitely a great concern of Palestinians. I think this momentum is starting to push Palestinians to talk across, sort of these quote unquote borders that exist between them. And so there's a strong hope that further organization will continue to occur among especially the sort of re-energized youth in Palestine. But let's be honest, it's hard to overturn oppressive regime policies. And so this is going to be a difficult uphill fight. And so there needs to be a continuing spotlight on what is going on. But yes, it's a concern. Yes, I think there's a lot of things different. And I am actually, I think for the first time, more hopeful than I am worried that the future will hold much of the same.
Finally, I've got a very difficult question for you, because it sort of looks into the future. It's going to be some guesswork, I suppose. But just taking the general strike as an inspiration, if we've had lots of Palestinians on in the last 2 weeks who have sort of said there does seem to be a level of unity among Palestinians, both within historic Palestine and in the diaspora, to an extent that hasn't been seen recently. So with a speculative hat on, what kind of movements of resistance do you see going forward? What do you think will be most prominent? We've got this general strike as an example now. What should people be watching out for, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think sort of a continuance of strikes, I think you'll see. I think this has been an immensely effective and sort of it's a type of activity that can sort of focus folks on the same target, which is, in this case, sort of the economy. I think one of the hardest things is that to mobilize around the fact that there are so much divisions among Palestinians, and like I said, I'm talking about borders, the limitations for Palestinians to get inside of Israel, for the people in Gaza to connect with those in the West Bank. So if I'm thinking forward, I think actions like the strike will be at least the starting point. I imagine that coordination across time and place is going to be made more difficult by Israel. There's going to be, there's been this attempt to sort of localize the various struggles of Palestinians. And so I think you're also going to see one of the key sort of groups here are going to be folks in the West, sort of leveraging their, political power to pressure their governments to sort of continue pushing change in Palestine. It's a difficult question. It really is. It's, the Palestinians, the people that I've spoken to who have very close family on the ground, myself and others, they're saying that, people are not sure what's going to come next, but people are energized and they're looking for the sort of the next thing. And so I imagine they'll start with, a continuance of strikes. I imagine you'll see some new organizations or the combination of multiple existing organizations coming together. I think, I think there's a lot of question marks, to be completely blunt, but this is more hope than I think we've seen in a long time, including from the older generation. I think that's something that really has inspired me, is they are excited for the first time in a long time.
Nasser Al-Masri, it's a positive note to end on in what's a situation where it's difficult to find positive notes. Thank you so much for coming on. We've really appreciated you giving your time to us this evening.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's go back to Palestinian resistance in the UK, or resistance to the war against Palestine in the UK. Compared to a general strike, this might seem insignificant, but I do think that actually, in terms of public opinion in this country, very, very significant. 2 more top footballers have taken out the Palestinian flag after a game. This was a Premier League game this time. Last time it was the FA Cup final. After a match against Fulham, Manchester United's Paul Pogba and Amad Diallo held up a Palestinian flag. Now, I should say to you, earlier this week, little insight into my WhatsApp chats with Aaron Bastani. Aaron messaged me after the FA Cup final when 2 footballers had held up the Palestinian flag. He said, if Paul Pogba waves the Palestinian flag after a football match, it's over. Then 2 days later, it happened. Dalia, I want to go to you on this. I know we normally avoid football when it's just us 2 on the shows because we struggle, but it does seem like the resistance to the oppression of Palestinians is really, widespread. It's by no means just limited to the usual suspects this time around. I feel like potentially a tide could be turning.
I think it's really difficult to say, as Nasser pointed out. I think oftentimes when there are these flashpoints, these sieges, obviously there is an ongoing constant violence taking place, but we often see a lot of, people speaking out, and we see, sort of a bit more awareness being built, and it often feels like things are about to change. And then sort of once there's a kind of ceasefire, it kind of we go back to that status quo. And I think the fact that Nasser mentioned that the older generation are feeling differently about this is really significant. But I think, the fact that we are seeing people speaking out now, particularly in the UK, and I think the shift in Congress in the US is absolutely a watershed, because there's always been a very different approach in Europe. There's always been a much stronger Palestine solidarity movement in Europe than in the US. It's always been very difficult. But the fact that we're seeing people speaking out is so significant, because a lot, and I tweeted about this earlier, I think today, I can't remember, days are a myth to me now, but there's been so much thrown at stigmatizing being internationalist in public life, in the public sphere. It's been portrayed, especially over the past few years, it's been portrayed as everything from, snowflake wokeness or bleeding heart liberalism to actually very dangerous, where people who express internationalist solidarity, especially with Palestinians, is marked as kind of dangerous and to be kind of excommunicated from public life. So the fact that people are still speaking out, and that that attempt to stigmatize internationalism in that way is sort of hasn't stuck, is incredibly reassuring, because I was concerned. I was worried that it had been effective. But I think contextualizing, especially this, even though Biden's response here it's a slight nudge, but it's still, entirely insufficient, because you can't really call for a ceasefire between 2 parties when you're practically drowning the much more powerful party, or the much more powerful side, in money and weapons. It doesn't really make sense. But I think another reason that, the diasporic and also the growing anti-racist consciousness, particularly in the global north, in the US and Europe, is also important, because we need to understand how rooted in racism the justificatory mechanisms that are used for occupation are. When we think about and in what ways has clear attack and clear oppression been successfully framed as self-defense? And it comes down to this idea that Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, people who, we are grouped together on the basis that we are something to be afraid of, that we're inherently dangerous, irrationally barbaric, and that preemptive violence is required and inevitable and natural because of who we are. And that is why this violence is indiscriminate. That is why it's constant, because it's the mere existence of Palestinians that is deemed threatening. And there is something about, the use of rancid water being sprayed on people in a way that sticks to their bodies for as they kind of, for days afterwards, that is so kind of symbolic of that. And I think that awareness of the role that racism plays, of how, this idea of reframing and being able to successfully frame occupation as self-defense, and how rooted that is in, and how much it resonates with those scripts of fear and disgust in which Arabs and Muslims are enmeshed, and how powerful that is. And I think that growing anti-racist consciousness that we've been seeing since 2015 has played a really significant role in, how diasporic communities, whether Arabs or not Arabs, are responding and understanding really what's going on here, and is cutting through a lot of that media discourse.
And I think that's all super important, especially cutting through that media discourse. It can feel like a bit of a barrier has been broken. Maybe I'm being overly hopeful today. Let's go to a couple of comments. Dina Alaxa tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Listening to Tysky Sour live today. Very glad to see Novara Media continue to platform Palestinians, not just as a one-off, but as a much needed continuous conversation about the human rights crisis the Palestinian people are facing right now. Really important comment. Thank you so much for that. I've been thinking today, it sounds kind of hippie-ish, but the fact that we can do all of these interviews on Zoom, and the fact that we can speak to so many Palestinians during this onslaught by Israel, I think has just so massively improved my understanding of what's going on. And I am just really delighted that we've been able to speak to so many people in historic Palestine and Palestinians in the diaspora. And yeah, I mean, obviously I completely concur with that comment. I just have to, I suppose, express my appreciation to all of the guests we've had over the past 2 weeks as well. Also a thanks to Zaina Sawafta for the £10 super chat. That's very kind. Of course, we do love your super chats. We are also completely dependent on our supporters. If you are a supporter, thank you so much. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Final story. The Labour Party has been struggling of late to explain what it stands for. This has damaged the personal reputation of party leader Keir Starmer, and it's also left shadow cabinet members in awkward positions when they're asked about Labour's vision and they have nothing to say. The farce continued when Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth appeared on Good Morning Britain to give this astonishing answer.
Have you guys sat down yet and decided what policy? Have you spoken to Keir Starmer? Have you sat in a room and gone, right, guys, what does the Labour Party stand for? Have you had that conversation yet?
Well, of course we have. We have our shadow ministerial,
So
our shadow cabinet meeting.
Can you share it with us then? What does the Labour Party now stand for?
I can't. They're confidential meetings. I can't.
Confidential meetings? You're a political.
Share it with
It's very clear. The Labour Party.
The Labour Party is.
So it's confidential. Normally when Keir Starmer gets asked, what's your vision? Our vision, he says something completely banal. Our vision is we're going to look outwards. Our vision is we're going to speak to the country. It means absolutely nothing, but at least it kind of, it works syntactically, even if it doesn't have any content. Jonathan Ashworth just went, it's confidential. Sorry. We may or may not have a vision, but if we did, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Right. And, in his defense, not many people were defending him, by the way. But if you were to defend him, you say, look, we're four years out from a general election. There was a very important set of elections earlier this month. And the Labour Party was surprised that in those elections, they did really poorly when, what they stand for is confidential. Right. So you got voters say, should I vote for the Conservative Party, who are offering me a vaccine rollout, who are offering to reindustrialise the north of England, who are offering to make Britain great again, or should I vote for the Labour Party, whose policies are confidential? Is it any surprise that Labour tanked in those elections when you've got the Shadow Health Secretary, very, very important job, being asked what Labour's vision is, what it stands for, and saying, well, that was discussed, but those meetings were confidential. Let's go to the next bit of that clip, because after getting teased by the host for his ridiculous answer, Ashworth tries to recover by giving a more concrete response to the vision question. Let's take a look.
The Labour Party understands that we have got to speak to the British people about their priorities and their interests and their concerns. And we're launching a big policy review, which we're going to take to the country, and we're going to engage the country in a discussion and a debate, and we're going to listen to the country about what it is they want, how they want this country to change. Because when I travel across the country, and I see it for myself in my own Leicester constituency and where I live in Leicester, that we can do much better than we're doing at the moment. Our schools can be much better. Our NHS can be much better. We've got nearly 5 million people on the waiting list. We need to sort that out. We can do much better to make the air that we breathe cleaner and our communities greener, and we can do more to invest in making our communities safer, and we've got to do more in the economy so people have well-paid jobs, not relying on low-paid temporary work or 0 hours contracts so they can buy their own home.
All right.
These are big issues that we're going to be focusing on in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay.
It is ironic, though, isn't it, Jonathan Ashworth, when you say we need to tell the electorate what we stand for, but we can't yet because it's confidential.
Well, I was talking about the particular meeting, but I mean, look, we are going to be having a big policy review with the country, and of course the meetings aren't that confidential. That was more of a sort of throwaway comment. But look, we're having a big policy debate and discussion with the country, and you'll see Labour coming out with exciting ideas.
I have to say, I kind of preferred the answer that it was confidential. You know, at least it was more memorable, because what did he say there? He tries to, recover himself, save himself. Says, we've got to speak to the British people about their priorities and their interests and their concerns. Do you not have any priorities, interests or concerns? The point of politics and political leadership is you have some concerns and you talk to the electorate about them. And yeah, you then listen to the electorate's concerns and you consider whether you should change your policies or whether you should modify them. But you don't go to the electorate with absolutely nothing. Because if you go to them with absolutely nothing, then what are you bringing to the table? You're not bringing anything to the table, right? And Labour there are not bringing anything to the table. When he does talk about more concrete things, it's just a list of a bunch of nice things. We'll make schools better. We'll make the NHS better. We'll make the air we breathe cleaner. Literally anyone could say that. You can be from any political party and say, oh, we'll make the NHS better. It's just a list of nice things. You have to explain why the Tories can't deliver that, why the Tories haven't delivered that. You can't just say, oh, we'll make everything better. What's your vision? Oh, we're the make things better party, right? It doesn't stack up. Dalia, I want your take on this particular interview. It was a bit of a head in hands moment, wasn't it?
I mean, it feels like Groundhog Day. It feels like every time I come on Tysky, there's another one of these interviews. And my question is, how have they not workshopped a better response to this? It's been several weeks now. Like, this is not a gotcha question. This is not unpredictable. Like, it's been several weeks now of these shambolic media appearances where they have been challenged on this. And I don't understand how Keir Starmer has all of the discipline in the world when it comes to, what socialist MPs tweet about and, socialist party members and expelling people and all of this, and yet doesn't have the ability to discipline his own front bench into effectively answering a question that everyone is asking and has been asking for several weeks. And that should be really, should be easy to answer. But also it makes me think about, going back to the earlier story in this week, in this show, where, that Starmerite tactic of, when he challenges the government, quote unquote, of just sort of basically endorsing the fundamental political and ideological values that guide what the government does, but just sort of saying that the government is incompetent at delivering it. That doesn't work when you look significantly more incompetent. You need a better tactic. And I think also that's the kind of strategic question. But then thinking about actually, the kind of moral and the ethical and the political question here. We are living in a moment when there is so much space for really transformative vision and for really transformative thinking. We've got multiple crises that are overlapping with each other, from climate to COVID, to the crisis in employment, in the fact that so much of the work that people do is not enough to sort of to adequately look after themselves and to adequately have security and stability. And this is one of those historical moments, a once in not just a generation, but several generations opportunity where the contradictions and the problems in the existing system are being sharpened and are being lived through in really visceral ways. And it's in these moments when resistance out of and replacing of those systems can be consolidated, whether it's, through transformative visions around work, whether it's transformative visions around climate change and, ecology or decentralization. And we have to remember that this is how neoliberalism itself gained power. It was through approaching a moment in crisis with transformative, obviously we believe for the negative, transformative visions and building the power to make that actually happen. And it's not easy. It's not a struggle. It's not easy. It's an uphill struggle. But it's also incumbent upon us. It's our historical duty as the generation living in this particular moment where we meet this cross-section of crises to be up to that job. And for Labour, something called the Labour Party, to be languishing in this moment and to be so indifferent and so anemic and to have no ambition other than to simply lower the expectations of what can change. It's a giant abdication of that duty. And what it will mean is that the space to reinvent and reconsider the way that we live our lives is going to be left to much more dangerous forces. And I think history is going to be very harsh on those who didn't have the mettle and sat behind and let that happen.
You do want to hear more from political voices who do take seriously the intersecting crises which society is facing and don't keep their political commitments confidential. Do make sure you subscribe to Novara Media if you have not already. We go live 3 times a week and put out videos every day. We're going to go to our final nugget of information for you tonight, which is new ratings, which has come out on Keir Starmer, his personal ratings. This is from YouGov, and it is asking people how they assess Keir Starmer according to various criteria, and it's not looking particularly good. Trustworthy or untrustworthy. 26% think he's trustworthy. 36% think he's untrustworthy. We certainly do. Maybe they've been watching Novara Media because the guy breaks every single one of his promises. Likeable, dislikable, also not going well. 24% say he's likable. 39% say he's dislikable. That's a shift of 5 in both directions. When it comes to decisiveness, the direction of travel is very worrying for Keir Starmer. Since March the 22nd, the number of people who think he is decisive has gone down 7 percentage points. It's now at 18%. And the people who think he's indecisive has gone up 9 percentage points to 48%. Equally worrying when it comes to strength. 14% of people think he's strong. That's down 8 points since 22nd of March. 47% think he's weak, which is up 11. And then finally, and this is the real, I suppose, knockout blow for Keir Starmer, whose whole image was supposed to be based on him being a competent leader. He might not stand for anything, but at least he's competent. Well, not according to the public. So currently 28% of the public say he is competent, which is down 7 points from March. 35% say he's incompetent, which is up 7 points. Dalia, this is very, very damning for the man, isn't it? I am starting to think for the first time, well, I've been thinking this for a couple of weeks now, that Keir Starmer probably won't make it until the next general election. How long do you think he's got?
Oh, yeah, to be honest, I think from the beginning of his tenure, I was like, this guy is not going to make it because he's so rapidly lost that base that he made up, especially when he suspended Jeremy Corbyn. I think if he made it to this time next year, I think that would be a good run for him. But yeah, where will the leadership challenge come from? That's the question.
Angela Rayner, deputy leader. She doesn't like the guy.
Classic.
And get the support within 12 months, I reckon. That's my betting tip for you there. Let's go to a comment. Andrew Bergman tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. How is it possible that Jonathan Ashworth is even more useless at public relations under a leadership that he isn't ideologically opposed to? A harsh but quite entertaining comment there. It is very true. There are so many of these people currently in the shadow cabinet who sort of say, oh yeah, we feel so free now. We really relate to the leader. We can express ourselves. We don't have to pretend we want the leader of the Labour Party to be Prime Minister. They're supposed to be in their element. They go on television. They can't answer a basic question. Maybe they'll start to realize actually it wasn't that bad being a front bench shadow minister with a leader who actually believed in something, because at least you had something to say. At least you had a reason to turn up to the TV studio. Now you might as well just stay at home. Might as well send a cardboard cutout of yourself. It's going to be slightly less awkward than when they ask you, what do you stand for? What's your position on this? And you say, it's confidential. I don't know. All I know is that we're going to look out to the country. We'll work out our position once we've done a focus group in this particular constituency that we're desperate to win back in 2024. Right? I'd prefer to stay at home. Let's put it like that. Dalia, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you on this Wednesday evening.
It's been wonderful. Thanks for having me.
It is always a pleasure. And thank you so much for watching Tysky Sour tonight. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. We will be back on Friday. I forget the days of the week sometimes these days, but we will be back on Friday. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.